Welcome, viewers. You are about to hear a captivating tale written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. A missing man, an ancient manuscript, a secret society with a sinister agenda. Don't forget to subscribe. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, The Case of the Gentleman Without a Past. The fog settled heavily over London as Sherlock Holmes strode purposefully through the mist, his tall figure a stark contrast against the dimly lit cobblestone streets. It was early morning and the usual bustle of the city had yet to stir. The world seemed wrapped in a silent shroud, as if waiting for something to unfold. The sharp, almost biting air seemed to seep through Holmes's coat, but he was impervious to the cold, his mind far more absorbed in his thoughts than any physical discomfort. He had a mind, as always, preoccupied with puzzles, and that morning it had already begun working through a new one. Holmes adjusted his scarf slightly as he turned onto the familiar street that led to Baker Street, his home for so many years. The rhythmic clink of his boots on the stone echoed against the narrow walls of the buildings. As always, his mind raced. He had seen it happen many times before, the careful order of life disrupted by a sudden mystery, the thrill of discovery, of unraveling a knot that had no apparent beginning or end, was always what kept him going. Upon reaching his residence, he paused, his keen eyes scanning the street once more. There was nothing unusual, yet he could not shake the feeling that something was amiss. It wasn't a change in the environment. London had always been full of secrets, but rather a change in himself. Lately, it seemed as though the cases he had taken on, once so challenging and absorbing, no longer held the same spark. He had lost a few that he felt were close to being solved, and though it was a rare occurrence for him, the feeling of failure had lingered more than he liked to admit. Holmes! Watson's voice broke through his musings. The good doctor stood in the doorway, the early morning light casting shadows on his face. His expression, always one of warmth and concern, seemed to deepen slightly as he looked at his friend. "You've been out here for a while. Are you coming in?" Holmes glanced back toward the fog-cloaked streets, then nodded, stepping inside. He had always admired Watson's ability to remain unaffected by the darker corners of their world. It was a contrast Holmes often found himself thinking about. Watson, with his sturdy, uncomplicated nature, was a rock against the shifting tides of Holmes's intellect. While Holmes' mind was often in turmoil, Watson stood as a constant reminder of the simpler joys of life. The interior of their apartment was bathed in the golden glow of early morning light, the warmth of the fireplace contrasting with the chill outside. Holmes glanced briefly at the desk covered in papers, the remnants of past investigations. It was there, among the scattered clues and unsolved riddles, that Holmes felt both at home and adrift. "Have you heard from Inspector Lestrade?" Holmes asked, his voice cutting through the silence that had settled between them. Watson shook his head. "No, but I imagine it won't be long before he seeks you out. He's always got something up his sleeve." Holmes's lips curved in a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Indeed, he does. But it's been some time since I've had a case that truly challenged me, Watson. I wonder if perhaps I've grown too accustomed to the patterns, to the predictable outcomes of these investigations." Watson raised an eyebrow, his hand hovering over his medical bag. "You? Too comfortable? That's a first." Holmes's smile faded as he turned toward the window, his gaze drifting across the misty skyline. "It's not a matter of comfort, Watson, it's a matter of necessity. When you've seen as much as I have, the mysteries begin to lose their luster. The solutions no longer feel like triumphs, but mere conclusions." The words hung in the air for a moment before Watson spoke again, quieter this time. "And yet, you always find a way to solve them?" Holmes nodded, though there was no real conviction in his agreement. Perhaps. Just then, the faint sound of a knock at the door interrupted the conversation. Holmes's sharp gaze flickered toward it, his mind already shifting into its investigative mode. Watson moved to open the door, and a figure stepped inside, carrying a letter sealed in a thick, ornate envelope. Holmes's eyes flickered over the figure, a delivery man with a look of slight anxiety in his eyes. "For Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said, holding out the letter. Holmes took it, his fingers brushing over the smooth paper. There was something about the way it was sealed, something that made his pulse quicken ever so slightly. It was a challenge, waiting to be unraveled. "I assume you have the appropriate payment," Watson said with a wry smile, but Holmes barely heard him. Holmes' focus was entirely on the letter. As he carefully broke the seal, he could feel a faint twinge of something, a sense of urgency perhaps, or the anticipation of something new. His instincts, always sharp, told him that this was not just any letter. It was something more, something that would demand all his attention. He unfolded the paper, reading the contents swiftly. As he did, the faintest smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Well, Watson," Holmes said, his voice barely above a whisper, "it seems that we may have just received the case I've been waiting for." Watson, always perceptive, raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" Holmes' eyes gleamed with a renewed intensity as he held up the letter. "A gentleman has gone missing. But this is no ordinary case. This is a puzzle wrapped in a mystery, and it's calling me." The morning was still young, but the streets of London had begun to stir as Holmes and Watson made their way to the address given in the letter. The fog had not entirely lifted, lingering in thick curls around the edges of the buildings. The occasional carriage rattled past, its wheels clattering against the cobblestones, and the muffled conversations of early risers seemed to blend with the soft rumble of the city awakening. Holmes walked with purpose, his mind already mapping out the possible avenues of investigation, but there was a lingering sense of curiosity that kept him from fully engaging in his usual analysis. The letter had promised intrigue, but there was something in the way it had been worded, a subtle urgency in the phrasing, that struck him as unusual. It was as if the writer knew something he was not ready to reveal, as if the case was not merely about a missing person, but about something much deeper. Watson, ever the attentive companion, glanced at his friend. "Holmes," he said, breaking the silence, "are you truly feeling up to another case so soon? You seemed distant earlier." Holmes glanced at Watson, his sharp gaze softening for a moment. "Distant? Perhaps. But you know as well as I do, Watson, that the mind cannot remain idle. It's the challenges that keep it sharp." He turned his gaze forward, eyes scanning the street with a certain intensity. "This case, however, it feels different. There is something hidden beneath the surface. I can feel it already." As they arrived at the building, a grand but somber townhouse tucked away from the main street, Holmes' instincts began to hum. It was a quiet neighborhood, the kind where whispers could carry through the air and the most minute of details were noticed by those who took the time to observe. Holmes had always had a knack for seeing the world differently than others, for hearing the unspoken in the smallest of sounds, and for catching the subtleties that others overlooked. They were greeted at the door by a man who appeared to be in his mid-40s. His face was weary, his eyes slightly sunken, but his posture straight and purposeful. His clothes were of the highest quality, tailored, expensive, but they seemed to carry a sense of weight, as if his wealth could not entirely lift the burden that clung to him. "Mr. Finn, I presume?" Holmes inquired, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "Yes, Mr. Holmes," the man replied, extending his hand in greeting. "Harold Finn, thank you for coming on such short notice." Holmes shook his hand, his grip firm but brief. As always, the detective's mind was already sifting through the details, looking for inconsistencies. Finn's nervous energy was palpable. His hand trembled slightly as he handed Holmes the letter that had initiated the request for assistance. Holmes took it without hesitation, glancing at the wax seal before setting it aside on the nearby table. "I trust you will be able to help?" Finn asked, his voice laced with a thin veneer of hope. Holmes studied the man carefully, his eyes narrowing slightly. There was more to Finn than met the eye. He was hiding something, this much was certain, but Holmes needed more than a hunch to form a conclusion. His gaze flicked over Finn's attire, his hands and his eyes. The man's fidgeting, the way he avoided direct eye contact for just a fraction of a second too long, it all spoke of anxiety. But was it fear or guilt? "We will see," Holmes replied, his tone measured but not dismissive. Tell me more about Mr. Lancaster. What is it that you're not telling me? Finn hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. Mr. Lancaster was a prominent member of our club. He vanished without a trace. We've searched everywhere. His room is untouched. There's no sign of a struggle, no clues as to his whereabouts. His voice faltered for a moment before he continued. I believe something terrible has happened to him. Holmes leaned in slightly, his voice low. And you believe that something terrible is connected to his disappearance, not a simple disappearance of his own volition? He glanced at Watson, then back at Finn. What are you not telling me, Mr. Finn? The man flinched, his eyes flickering briefly to a nearby door, as though expecting someone to enter. The briefest of pauses followed. Finn inhaled deeply, trying to compose himself. I don't know what to believe anymore, Mr. Holmes. All I know is that James Lancaster is a man who kept to himself, until recently. Then, a few weeks ago, he started receiving strange visitors, men I didn't recognize, foreigners, and his mood changed. He became paranoid, reclusive. Holmes's gaze never wavered, his mind racing. And you didn't think to inform the authorities of this sooner? Finn's shoulders sagged slightly as he looked down, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. I didn't want to make a scene. I thought he would come around, but when he didn't show up for the last meeting, we knew something was wrong. Holmes studied the man for a moment, weighing the sincerity of his words. His eyes then flicked over to the surrounding room. The walls were lined with bookshelves and portraits. The atmosphere one of quiet luxury, but it was also sterile. It lacked warmth, personal connection. Everything felt curated, controlled. But beneath the veneer, there was something more. May I see his room? Holmes asked, already turning toward the staircase. Finn looked momentarily hesitant, but then nodded. Of course, right this way. As they ascended the grand staircase, Holmes's senses sharpened. Each step felt deliberate, each movement observed with the precision of a man who had spent his life studying the subtle details of the world around him. The scent of polished wood mixed with the faint hint of tobacco in the air. Something was amiss in this house, and it was not just the disappearance of Lancaster. When they reached the room, Holmes barely waited for Finn to open the door before stepping inside. The room was meticulously arranged, almost too perfect. The bed was made with an exactness that seemed more ceremonial than practical. A large desk dominated one corner, papers neatly stacked, but with an odd sense of incompleteness. On the nightstand, a glass of untouched water sat next to an empty book. Everything about the room screamed a carefully curated normalcy. But the small details, the missing personal items, the unnerving stillness suggested something far more unsettling. "Tell me about this," Holmes said, moving to a small, ornately carved wooden box that rested on the desk. It seemed entirely out of place, not matching the surroundings. Finn swallowed visibly. That was Mr. Lancaster's. I don't know what's inside, but he kept it locked away. Holmes' eyes glinted. Indeed, and now I believe it is the key to everything. He turned back to Finn. Do you have a key to this box, Mr. Finn? Finn hesitated before reaching into his coat pocket, his hand trembling slightly as he handed the key to Holmes. Holmes carefully turned the key in the small, intricately carved lock. The soft click that followed seemed to echo in the otherwise silent room. His fingers trembled just slightly as he lifted the lid of the box. The inside was lined with a deep burgundy velvet that contrasted starkly with the pallid light filtering in from the window. Within, there were no documents, no trinkets, but rather a single object wrapped in dark cloth. Holmes's sharp eyes never wavered as he carefully unwrapped the item, his movements deliberate, controlled. Watson, who had been observing in silence, stepped closer. "What is it?" he asked, the curiosity in his voice evident as he peered over Holmes's shoulder. Holmes didn't answer immediately. He was focused on the object before him, an antique pocket watch, its casing tarnished with age but meticulously well crafted. The gold chain attached to it gleamed faintly, though its once lustrous finish had been dulled by time. He held the watch up to the light, examining it from every angle. A slight frown creased his brow as he noticed something faintly inscribed along the edge. It was an inscription in a language he didn't immediately recognize, though his mind quickly worked through it. Latin, of all things. A name appeared in sharp relief beneath the scratched surface. Vinculum aeternum. It means eternal bond, Holmes muttered, more to himself than to Watson. He set the watch down, his fingers lingering on its surface for a moment longer than necessary. There was something unsettling about the way it seemed to pulse with significance, as though it held more than just the memories of its owner. It felt like an artifact pulled from a world not entirely its own. "Do you believe this is why Lancaster has disappeared?" Watson asked, his voice edged with confusion. "Is it some kind of clue?" Holmes didn't respond at once. His mind was racing, working through the connections, the details that had yet to form a cohesive whole. The watch was not just a relic, it was a symbol, a connection to something far deeper than Lancaster's personal life. Holmes could feel it. He was getting closer, but the path remained shadowed by the unknown. It was a case that did not simply involve a missing man, but a mystery that had grown in layers, each piece shrouded in enigma. "I believe this watch is far more than it seems," Holmes said finally, his voice tinged with an eerie calm. "It is a key to something far older, Watson. This man Lancaster was not merely a victim of a simple disappearance. This is a puzzle crafted by someone with an eye for detail and an appreciation for the extraordinary." The detective paused, turning toward Finn, who had been watching quietly from the doorway. His eyes flickered nervously, betraying the anxiety he had been trying to conceal. "Mr. Finn," Holmes said, his voice slicing through the silence like a sharpened knife, "tell me more. Where did this watch come from? Who gave it to Lancaster?" Finn shifted uncomfortably. His eyes darted to the floor before meeting Holmes's gaze. I don't know, Mr. Holmes. Lancaster never spoke of where it came from. It seemed to be his most prized possession, though. He kept it locked away, always carrying it with him. He said it had been passed down through generations, but he never explained what it meant. Holmes didn't take his eyes off the man. There was something else, something Finn was withholding. His hesitation, his strained composure, everything about his behavior pointed to a deeper lie. "There is more," Holmes said sharply, and it wasn't a question. "You know something about this, Mr. Finn. You've been far too nervous since we arrived." Finn stiffened, his face pale under Holmes' penetrating gaze. "I told you all I know," he replied, his voice edged with rising panic. "You have to believe me, Mr. Holmes. I'm telling you the truth." Holmes's eyes softened for the briefest of moments before narrowing once more. "I believe you, Mr. Finn, but the truth will come to light regardless. The question is whether you will be part of that truth or simply caught in the web of it." The room seemed to grow colder, and for a moment even the usually steady Watson appeared slightly unsettled. Holmes turned away from Finn and back toward the watch, studying it again. He could sense it now, the faintest undercurrent of something far more dangerous at play. There was a history to this watch, a story that Lancaster had carried with him, but one that had remained veiled, locked away until now. Holmes reached for the watch once more, turning it over in his hands. Beneath the inscription, a number of faint, almost imperceptible symbols were etched into the casing. Symbols that resembled ancient markings, ones Holmes had seen only in old books, in tales of forgotten treasures and hidden secrets. It was then that the real weight of the case settled on his shoulders. "I believe this watch is not simply a keepsake, Watson," Holmes said, his voice low and intense. "It is a map to something Lancaster was unwilling to share, something he feared, and someone in this very house, is willing to kill to keep it hidden." The detective turned back to Finn, whose expression had become one of genuine dread. "This watch is the key to understanding why Lancaster vanished. But I will need your full cooperation if we are to solve this." Finn's lips parted, but no words came out. His silence spoke volumes. the weight of his knowledge pressing down on him like a physical burden. "Come," Holmes said, his gaze piercing. "I believe we have enough to proceed. But the next step in this case will take us far deeper than we have yet gone." Watson, who had remained quiet during the exchange, spoke up. "Holmes, do you think Lancaster's disappearance is connected to these symbols? Could this be about more than just a missing man?" Holmes looked at Watson, his eyes gleaming with the certainty of someone who had already begun to see the pieces fall into place. "I do believe so, Watson, and I have a suspicion that someone in this very house knows far more than they are willing to admit." The pieces were beginning to align, but with each step Holmes took toward the truth, he could feel the danger closing in, a web spun too tightly for any of them to escape unscathed. The room fell into a heavy silence after Holmes's declaration. Finn, standing at the threshold of the room, seemed to shrink under the detective's unyielding gaze, his hands clasped in front of him, his knuckles white from the pressure. Holmes glanced at Watson, who, sensing the growing tension, offered a quiet nod. It was time to move forward, to unravel the threads that had been so deliberately twisted. Holmes placed the watch back into its box with an almost reverent touch, as though he was carefully tucking away a piece of a puzzle that would soon demand all his attention. He turned toward Finn, his tone suddenly as calm as the surrounding stillness. "Tell me, Mr. Finn, who else was in the house the night Lancaster disappeared? Who had access to his private things?" Finn swallowed hard, glancing nervously at the door before answering. "Well, the usual club members, of course. We have a small circle of people who come by for our meetings, and then there are the servants, but they rarely enter his room. Mr. Lancaster was a very private man. It was only recently, when he started receiving those visitors, that I noticed changes." Holmes's eyes flickered briefly to the door. "And these visitors, Mr. Finn? Can you describe them?" Finn hesitated again, his eyes darting toward the other members of the house. His discomfort was growing more evident, but Holmes did not press him further. Not yet. There were other ways to gather information. He gestured for Watson to follow him, turning back toward the door. "We will need to speak with everyone who had contact with Lancaster recently. This includes the servants, as you mentioned, and anyone who might have had access to his things." As they stepped out into the hallway, the atmosphere in the house seemed to grow heavier, as if the walls themselves were watching them, listening to every word. Watson, ever observant, couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Finn's story than he was letting on. But Holmes was already several steps ahead, his mind racing through the potential suspects. Holmes led Watson down a narrow corridor toward the stairs that descended to the servant quarters. The house, though grand, had an air of neglect about it. The polished wood floors creaked beneath their feet, and the soft murmurs of the house staff carried up from below. It was a stark contrast to the imposing facade of the building, as though the interior life of the house was far more complex and more tangled than it appeared on the surface. At the bottom of the stairs, Holmes stopped briefly, glancing at the few servants who were going about their duties in the small, dimly lit kitchen. A woman with a plain face and sharp eyes looked up from the stove, her hands still working with practiced ease. She was older, perhaps in her late 50s, but her sharp gaze suggested that she had seen more than her fair share of strange happenings. Holmes approached her first, his eyes narrowing as he observed her demeanor. "Mrs. Fowler, I presume?" Holmes asked, his voice polite but probing. The woman nodded stiffly. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. I assume you're here about Mr. Lancaster?" Holmes' eyes sharpened. "Indeed. We've been investigating his disappearance. I trust you have nothing to hide." She paused, her gaze flicking from Holmes to Watson and then back again. "Nothing to hide, sir, but I did see things. I'm sure of it." Holmes inclined his head slightly, his interest piqued. "What things, Mrs. Fowler?" The woman's face became even more guarded. "I've seen Mr. Lancaster talk to men. Strange men, if you ask me. Foreigners, the kind who didn't seem to belong. I didn't ask questions, mind you. I know my place. But there was something about them, something off." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his voice softer now. "Did you overhear anything? Did Lancaster speak of the nature of these men, or of their business? Mrs. Fowler hesitated again, her gaze flicking nervously toward the kitchen door. I did hear him mention something once, just once, something about a deal perhaps, a dangerous deal, and a name. I didn't catch the name, but I know he seemed afraid. Holmes's mind raced. A deal? A dangerous one at that. This was the kind of lead he had been hoping for. The name remained elusive, but it was a start, a crucial one. Do you know when the last of these visitors came? Holmes pressed. Mrs. Fowler nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. A few nights ago. I saw one of them leave late. They were arguing. It was loud enough to wake me. Did you see which direction he went? Watson asked, his tone more direct than Holmes's had been. No, Mrs. Fowler replied, shaking her head. He was too far away, but I know Mr. Lancaster didn't follow him out, not that night. Holmes exchanged a glance with Watson, a silent agreement passing between them. This was the kind of lead that would push them forward. There were men involved, a deal gone wrong, and now a name hidden somewhere within the folds of Lancaster's final days. The puzzle pieces were slowly starting to fit together, but there were still too many gaps. Holmes turned back to Mrs. Fowler, his voice calm but commanding. I will need to speak with the other servants. If you recall anything else, I expect you to inform me immediately. She nodded, still unsure, but compliant. Of course, Mr. Holmes. I won't forget. Holmes gestured for Watson to follow him as he moved toward the next servants' quarters. The air had become thicker, the tension rising with every step. The walls of the house seemed to close in around them, pressing them towards something hidden, something dark. As they approached the next room, Holmes paused. A thought had struck him, one that began to spin a new thread in the tangled web of the case. Watson, he murmured, his voice low. There's something I'm missing, something we're overlooking. I can feel it. Watson, ever the grounded counterpart, looked at his friend with concern. What do you mean? Holmes' gaze narrowed, his mind already working through the possibilities. The watch, the inscriptions, the secrecy. There's more to Lancaster's life than we've seen. We've only scratched the surface. The morning light filtered through the narrow windows of the servants' quarters, casting long shadows on the worn wooden floors. Holmes and Watson moved through the space, now fully immersed in the task of untangling the threads of Lancaster's disappearance. Each room they entered seemed to hold its own secrets, layers of tension veiled beneath the routine of daily life. The house, despite its grandeur, had an air of neglect, and Holmes couldn't help but wonder if the estate's impeccable appearance was merely a facade for something far darker. Holmes motioned for Watson to follow him down the hallway to the next servants' quarters, a small but tidy room belonging to a man named George, one of the footmen who had been in the house during Lancaster's final days. As they approached the door, Holmes could already feel the weight of the air shift. There was an unease that seemed to hang over the house, a nervous energy that whispered of hidden truths and fractured lives. Holmes knocked once, sharply, and a moment later the door creaked open. George, a young man in his early 20s with a sharp jaw and wide-set eyes, stood before them. His appearance was neat, but his hands, large, with calluses, betrayed a life of physical labor. He looked at Holmes and Watson with a mixture of wariness and curiosity, his expression shifting from cautious politeness to guarded uncertainty. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, George greeted, his voice low, his gaze flicking nervously to the side. What can I do for you? Holmes didn't waste time with pleasantries. We're investigating the disappearance of Mr. Lancaster, and we would appreciate your cooperation. You were present when he vanished. I need you to tell me everything you saw and heard during that time. George shifted uneasily, his gaze dropping to the floor before meeting Holmes's eyes again. I don't know much, sir. Mr. Lancaster wasn't one for conversations, not with the staff, but I saw him just before he disappeared. He was with a man, a foreigner. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I know they were talking in whispers. Holmes raised an eyebrow, his eyes narrowing with interest. A foreigner? And this man, He was a regular visitor? George hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Not regular, no, but I've seen him a few times. Always at night, always leaving when the house was quiet. Mr. Lancaster seemed to trust him, though. I don't know why, but you never overheard anything more substantial? Watson interjected, his voice more direct. Anything that might give us a clearer picture? George shook his head, but Holmes could see the lie in his eyes, the hesitation before his words. No, nothing like that, just whispers. Holmes studied the young man for a moment longer, sensing there was more he wasn't saying. The nervous twitch of his hands, the way his eyes avoided Holmes's gaze. It all pointed to a discomfort that seemed out of place. "You're withholding something, George," Holmes said, his voice cool but unwavering. "This is a matter of great urgency. What is it that you're not telling me?" George's face flushed, and he opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Holmes and Watson both turned their heads, to find another servant approaching. It was Thomas Whitley, the man who had been mentioned by both Finn and Mrs. Fowler as someone with a more direct connection to Lancaster's dealings. Whitley's presence was striking, his tall frame and sharp features belying a calm demeanour that barely masked the tension simmering beneath. "Mr. Holmes?" Whitley said, his voice smooth but with a hint of underlying concern. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. I understand you're looking into Lancaster's disappearance." Holmes turned toward him, his eyes studying the man with the precision of a hawk. "Indeed, Mr. Whitley. I was just speaking with George here about the events surrounding Mr. Lancaster's disappearance." Whitley's gaze flickered briefly to George, who suddenly seemed uncomfortable under the scrutiny. "I hope George has been forthcoming," Whitley continued, his voice unchanging. "I'm certain he has nothing to hide." "I'm sure he doesn't," Holmes replied, his tones suggesting otherwise. "But I would be very interested to hear what you know, Mr. Whitley. Perhaps you can shed some light on the situation." Whitley's lips curled into a polite smile, but there was a coolness in his eyes. "Of course, Mr. Holmes. I've been a friend of Mr. Lancaster's for some time, though I admit I don't know as much about his personal dealings as I would like. But I can tell you one thing. He was under a great deal of stress, and I believe the situation may have escalated. I overheard him arguing with someone just days before he disappeared." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Who was he arguing with?" Whitley paused, his eyes narrowing, as if weighing whether to reveal this information. "I don't know the man's name, but he wasn't a member of the club. He was insistent, and Mr. Lancaster wasn't himself. He seemed desperate. You see, Lancaster had recently come into possession of something very valuable. I believe it's possible someone thought they could use that against him." Holmes's gaze sharpened as the pieces started to fall into place. The valuable item, the mysterious man, the sudden disappearance. Everything was connected. "A valuable item," he repeated. "What exactly are you referring to, Mr. Whitley?" Whitley's expression became harder, his voice stiffening. "I don't know the full details. Lancaster never confided in me about it, but I know he was acting strangely after he received it. I suspect it's the key to everything." Holmes took a step closer to Whitley, his sharp eyes never leaving the man's face. "I see," Holmes said quietly. "And why did you wait until now to inform me of this, Mr. Whitley?" Whitley hesitated, clearly uncomfortable under Holmes's unwavering scrutiny. "I didn't think it was important at first, but now that the situation has escalated, I believe it is." Holmes nodded slowly, his mind racing with possibilities. "I will need to speak with everyone who might know more about this item. I trust you will cooperate, Mr. Whitley?" "Of course," Whitley replied, though his tone was laced with something that Holmes couldn't quite place. "I'm just concerned, Mr. Holmes. You don't know what you're dealing with here. There are forces at play that, well, you'll see soon enough." Holmes turned back to George, who had been silently watching the exchange. "As for you, George, we're not finished here. I suggest you think carefully about what you've shared with us today." George swallowed hard but nodded, the weight of Holmes' words sinking in. Holmes turned to Watson as they moved to leave the servant quarters. "The game is afoot, Watson," he said quietly, a hint of something akin to satisfaction in his voice. "But there is much more to this than simply a missing man. We have several players, but who is truly in control?" As they made their way down the corridor, Holmes couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. This case was no longer just about uncovering Lancaster's whereabouts. It was about something deeper, something far more dangerous. The walls of this house were beginning to close in around them, and Holmes had no doubt that more secrets were waiting to be uncovered. The house had taken on a heavier air since Holmes and Watson had begun their investigation. Every step seemed to echo with the promise of revelations, but the deeper they delved, the more tangled the threads became. Holmes walked with purpose, his sharp eyes taking in every detail, every nuance. As they made their way through the grand hallways of the house once again, the silence between them was thick, heavy with the weight of the contradictions they had encountered. They were closing in on something, Holmes could feel it, but the puzzle was not yet complete. There were gaps, discrepancies, that gnawed at the edges of the investigation. "I don't trust Whitley," Holmes murmured, his voice low, almost to himself, as they moved through the darkening corridor. "His behavior is too practiced, too polished, and yet there's something raw beneath it all." Watson, who had been silently following, glanced sideways at Holmes. "You think he's hiding something?" Holmes nodded, his brow furrowed. "I do. He's too quick to offer information, too eager to steer the investigation in the direction he wants. But there's something more, something he's not saying. And the way he reacted when I asked about Lancaster's possessions, it was as if he already knew what I was looking for." They reached the door to the library, the room where they had first met Finn. Holmes paused, his hand hovering over the door handle as he took in the quiet. The faint smell of aged wood and leather filled the air. The room felt both imposing and secretive. Bookshelves lined the walls, their spines densely packed with knowledge and history. But Holmes knew there were far more secrets here than any volume could hold. "Holmes, what do you make of the servant, Mrs. Fowler?" Watson asked, his voice steady but laced with curiosity. "She seems honest enough, but there's something about her story that doesn't quite add up. Why would she only tell us what she knew after we pressed her?" Holmes didn't respond immediately, his gaze still fixed on the door before him. He was turning over the details, running the pieces of the puzzle through his mind. The contradictions were everywhere. Finn's agitation, the cryptic warnings from Mrs. Fowler, Whitley's polished yet guarded demeanour, it all pointed toward a deeper web of deceit, one that was clear now. Someone here was manipulating the truth. Finally, Holmes turned to Watson, his eyes gleaming with the quiet intensity of a man on the edge of discovery. "You're right, Watson. Mrs. Fowler's hesitation is no coincidence. She knew more than she let on, and I suspect it was because she was protecting someone. But who?" Holmes gave a sharp nod, pushing the door open. "There's more to this than a missing man and a foreigner. It's a web of motives, and we must untangle it piece by piece. We're missing a key detail. I can feel it." The room was dim, the light from the outside world barely creeping through the curtains. The only sound was the soft rustling of papers and the occasional creak of the old furniture. Holmes moved swiftly across the room, his boots barely making a sound on the wooden floor. His eyes scanned the space with their usual precision, pausing briefly to inspect the large desk near the window. As Watson followed, he could feel the tension that hung between them, the quiet hum of Holmes' focused mind at work. The detective paused, his fingers brushing across the edge of the desk, and then reached for a drawer. It opened with a soft creak, and inside Holmes found something that made his pulse quicken, a stack of letters neatly tied together with a ribbon. But it wasn't the letters themselves that caught his attention, it was the seal. A crimson wax seal bearing the same strange symbol Holmes had seen on the watch earlier, the same Latin inscription, Vinculum Aeternum. Holmes's fingers lingered on the sealed letters, his mind already racing. The connection was undeniable now. The foreign investor, the visitors, the secretive behavior, all of it was pointing to the same thing. These letters, he knew, held the answers. But there was something more hidden in plain sight. As Holmes broke the seal, the room seemed to hold its breath. "Watson," Holmes said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I think we've found our missing piece." Watson moved closer, watching as Holmes began to sift through the papers. Each letter was dated and signed in an elegant hand, each written in the same precise language. But it was the content that caught Holmes's attention. The letters were business agreements, contracts, unusual ones filled with language that bordered on the cryptic. But what stood out most was the mention of an item, one that had been traded, one that had changed hands more than once. Holmes's brow furrowed as he read aloud from one of the letters. "The agreement is final. The artifact will be delivered by the end of the month. Ensure that the transaction remains confidential. No one can know of its existence. It is not just a treasure, it is the key." A chill ran down Watson's spine. What artifact? What key? Holmes' gaze lifted from the letter, his eyes sharp and calculating. "I don't know yet, Watson, but I suspect it's the item Lancaster came into possession of recently, the same item that caused his paranoia." Watson looked at Holmes, his face grave. "And the foreign visitor? The one George mentioned?" Holmes nodded slowly, his fingers gripping the letter tighter. "Yes, I believe he was more than just an interested party. He's the one behind it all. The question now is, why did Lancaster fear him so much, and what does the key represent?" Before Watson could respond, the door to the library creaked open, and Finn appeared in the doorway, his face pale and his eyes wide. He hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice shaky, "there's something you need to see. I believe you're getting too close to the truth." Holmes turned toward him, his expression unreadable. "I'm afraid, Mr. Finn, that the truth is not something we can avoid, but you are welcome to join us in the final step toward it." Finn swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he stepped deeper into the room. Holmes didn't move, his gaze fixed on Finn. "Now, Mr. Finn, I believe we should continue our conversation. You may have something more to tell me, something you've been holding back." Finn's lips parted, his eyes flickering with a blend of fear and uncertainty. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words failed him. It was clear now. The walls were closing in. Holmes stood still, his eyes narrowed as he observed Finn's trembling form. The man seemed to shrink under the weight of the investigation, his earlier composure dissolving into an anxious fog. His face was pale, and his hands fidgeted nervously at his sides, betraying the tension he was trying so desperately to conceal. For a moment Holmes said nothing, his gaze steady and piercing. There was something about Finn's presence now that felt different. He was no longer merely a concerned club member, but a player in a larger game. Finn swallowed hard, the sound echoing in the stillness of the room. I'm afraid I've said too much already, Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand the dangers at play here. It's not just a missing man. It's something far worse, something you can't begin to grasp." Holmes' lips curled slightly, his eyes never leaving Finn. "On the contrary, Mr. Finn, I believe I've begun to understand more than you think. This isn't merely about Mr. Lancaster's disappearance. It's about what Lancaster uncovered, a secret that someone is willing to kill for." Watson, who had been quietly observing the exchange, stepped forward. "What secret are you referring to, Holmes? This entire case has been shrouded in mystery, but you seem to be connecting dots that none of us have yet seen." Holmes finally turned his gaze to Watson, his mind working at a rapid pace, drawing connections between the scattered clues. "It's clear now, Watson. Lancaster was in possession of something far more valuable than a mere artifact. He was in possession of power, something that could change the course of a great many things, if only the right hands could control it." Finn seemed to flinch at the words, his lips parting as though he wanted to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Holmes continued, his voice growing more measured, more focused. Lancaster's paranoia wasn't the result of some trivial concern. He had discovered something that could put him at the center of a very dangerous conspiracy, and someone wanted it badly enough to make sure he disappeared. Holmes paced slowly around the room, his mind clicking into place like the final pieces of a complicated puzzle. The foreign visitors, the strange behavior, the sealed letters, this all points to one thing. An artifact, yes, but not just any artifact. This is something more. This is a key to a secret, something buried deep within history, something that has the potential to unlock what, exactly? Holmes paused, his eyes flicking toward the desk where the letters still lay open, their contents slowly revealing the truth. He reached for one of them and read aloud, the words echoing in the still air. The agreement is final. The artifact will be delivered by the end of the month. Ensure that the transaction remains confidential. No one can know of its existence. It is not just a treasure, it is the key. The words seemed to reverberate through the room, filling it with a sense of foreboding. A key, Holmes repeated quietly. But what does it unlock, and who is willing to go to such lengths to possess it? Finn's face grew even more pale, his lips trembling. I don't know, Mr. Holmes. I swear I don't, but I know the men Lancaster was dealing with. They were part of something much larger than a simple business transaction. These weren't just collectors or investors. These were men with power, men with resources. Watson leaned in, his face set in concentration. What do you mean by power, Finn? What kind of men are we talking about? Holmes turned back to Finn, his expression unreadable. Mr. Finn, I suggest you be more forthcoming. I've already gathered a great deal of information, but I need you to tell me everything you know. There is no room for half-truths in this investigation. If you hold anything back, it will only prolong the inevitable. Finn opened his mouth to speak, but then closed it, his eyes darting nervously between Holmes and Watson. The air in the room was thick, the tension rising as Holmes stood before him like a silent judge, waiting for the truth to spill from his lips. Finally, with a deep breath, Finn spoke, his voice shaky. There's a group, a secret society of sorts. I don't know much about them, but I've heard whispers. They've been around for centuries, dealing in artifacts and relics, things that have historical significance, things that could change the way people think, the way people act. Lancaster stumbled upon something they were willing to kill for, and when he refused to part with it, his voice trailed off and Holmes's gaze never left his face. And so they made sure he disappeared. Holmes finished for him, the weight of the words settling heavily in the room. Finn nodded, his face a mask of fear and resignation. Yes, and they'll do the same to anyone who tries to stand in their way. You're putting yourself in danger, Mr. Holmes. These men, these people, they have resources. They can make anyone vanish without a trace. Holmes folded his arms, considering the new information. The pieces were falling into place faster now, but the picture was still far from clear. A secret society, an artifact of unimaginable importance, a conspiracy that reached deep into the shadows of history. This case was no longer just a puzzle. It was a battle for control, for power, for knowledge that had been hidden away for generations. This society, Holmes murmured, they are seeking control over something far greater than an artifact. They are seeking to control a secret, a key to something that could change the very fabric of society. Watson looked at him, his voice tinged with concern. But what is the secret, Holmes? What is this key really for? Holmes paused, his mind working furiously to connect the dots. The watch, the letters, Finn's confession. It all pointed to something vast and dangerous. I don't know yet, Watson, but I suspect it's something that has been kept hidden for centuries, something that could reshape the future. And Lancaster was merely the latest victim in a long line of people who have come too close to it. Holmes turned back to Finn, his gaze now softer, though still intense. We are getting closer, Mr. Finn. But there is more to this story, and you have to understand. We will uncover it, whether you wish it or not." The room was thick with tension, the air crackling with the weight of impending revelation. Holmes stood before the large fireplace, the crackling of the fire a faint backdrop to the rapid thoughts running through his mind. The pieces were finally coming together, but there was still one key element missing, one final question that needed to be answered. He turned to face Finn, who had remained silent since their last conversation. The man's face was pale, his eyes wide with apprehension, as if he knew the storm was about to break. Holmes spoke first, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable authority. "You've told me much, Mr. Finn, but there is still more you are withholding. I am not interested in half-truths. You know as well as I do that we are now playing with forces far greater than a mere missing person." Finn's eyes flickered nervously, but there was no more avoiding the truth. Holmes could feel the moment coming, the culmination of the investigation, and it had arrived. Finn finally spoke, his voice quivering slightly as though his words were being forced out of him. It's not just about the artifact, Mr. Holmes," Finn began, his eyes darting around the room, searching for something he could no longer find. "It's about control. This society, they want more than just knowledge. They want influence. They want to shape the future, to rewrite history." Holmes stepped closer, his gaze fixed on Finn with a sharp intensity. "And Lancaster, what did he uncover? What exactly was he holding that made him such a target?" Finn hesitated for a moment longer, his eyes dropping to the floor, unwilling to meet Holmes' gaze. Finally he spoke, the words coming in a rush as if the floodgates had been opened. "It's a manuscript, Mr. Holmes. An ancient manuscript. It contains secrets. Secrets about power, knowledge, and the true origins of the society itself. It's something that could change everything. Lancaster had no idea what he'd found until it was too late." The words landed heavily in the room, each syllable more unsettling than the last. Holmes remained silent, allowing the weight of the revelation to settle. He turned to Watson, who had been observing the exchange with increasing unease. The doctor's expression was one of disbelief, his brow furrowed as he processed the implications. "A manuscript," Watson repeated, his voice thick with disbelief. "But why would a simple document be worth so much? What is it that this manuscript holds?" Holmes turned back to Finn, his mind already racing through the possibilities. "And where is this manuscript now, Mr. Finn? You said Lancaster had it, but what became of it after his disappearance?" Finn took a step back, his face a mask of fear. "I don't know," he whispered. "I don't know, but I believe it's still here, somewhere in this house." The words hung in the air like a dark promise. Holmes could feel the pulse of urgency, the need to find that manuscript before it was lost again. The stakes were no longer about finding Lancaster. They were about stopping whatever this secret society intended to do with the knowledge that had been locked away for so long. Holmes turned sharply, addressing Watson. "We need to search this house thoroughly. The manuscript is here, I'm certain of it." Watson nodded, his face grim. "But if they've been after it this long, then we're not the only ones searching. Whoever these men are, they won't stop until they have it." Holmes's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. "And neither will we, Watson. We must find it before they do." Without another word, they moved quickly through the house, retracing their steps, searching every room, every drawer, every crevice. But the house, once so full of secrets, now seemed to pulse with the weight of its hidden history. Every corner felt watched. Every shadow seemed to conceal something. Holmes's mind was in overdrive, considering every possibility, every potential hiding spot, but nothing felt certain. Not yet. They reached the library once again, the place where it had all started. The bookshelves loomed like silent sentinels, their rows of tomes offering no clues, only an illusion of order. Holmes moved with deliberate speed, his eyes scanning the room. He turned to Finn, who had been following them in silence, his anxiety growing palpable. "Where exactly did you last see Lancaster with the manuscript?" Holmes asked. his voice low but commanding. Finn swallowed hard. In the study, the one upstairs. He was reading it late at night, but then he started acting strange. He said it was too much, too dangerous. He locked it away in the drawer and that's the last I saw of it. Holmes nodded, his mind already working through the logistics. The study. Very well, let's go. The staircase creaked beneath their feet as they ascended, the weight of the moment pressing down on them like an invisible force. As they reached the study, Holmes' heart began to beat faster. This was it, the final stretch of the case. The truth, hidden away for so long, was within their grasp. But so were the dangers that came with it. Holmes could feel it now, the sense of impending confrontation. The study door was slightly ajar, the faintest sliver of light spilling through. Holmes pushed it open, and the room revealed itself. A place of quiet contemplation, books stacked neatly along the walls, a desk covered in scattered papers, a chair pulled out as if someone had just risen, but the desk drawer. Holmes' eyes were drawn to it immediately. He crossed the room swiftly, his fingers brushing against the cold wood of the drawer's edge. With a single, precise motion, he pulled it open. There, beneath a pile of books, lay the manuscript. The ancient pages were carefully bound, their edges worn with age. The cover was dark, almost indiscernible in the dim light, but the insignia embossed on the front was unmistakable. The same symbol, vinculum aeternum, was stamped into the leather, gleaming faintly in the shadows. Holmes reached for it, his fingers brushing over the cover with a mixture of reverence and resolve. As he lifted the manuscript, the room seemed to grow stiller, the weight of the discovery settling in. The key to the mystery, to the conspiracy, to the very heart of this case, was now in their hands. The manuscript felt heavier than it looked in Holmes's hands, its ancient cover almost warm beneath his fingers as he turned it over, inspecting the intricate seal stamped into the leather. The air around him seemed to thrum with significance, the weight of the discovery hanging in the room like a storm waiting to break. Watson stood at the threshold of the study, his gaze flicking from Holmes to the manuscript, then back again. His usually steady face was drawn with concern, though his expression showed the faintest hint of relief. The mystery was nearly unraveled, but the danger remained palpable. Holmes had the manuscript in his hands now. The answers they had been chasing were here, trapped in the pages, and he could feel the power of those answers surge through the room. He couldn't help but marvel at the secrecy that had surrounded this object, how it had slipped from one pair of hands to another over centuries, each owner adding a layer of shadow and intrigue until Lancaster had stumbled upon it. "It's over now, Holmes, isn't it?" Watson asked quietly, his voice laced with a mixture of relief and residual tension. The steady crackle of the fire was the only sound that filled the silence between them. Holmes did not immediately answer. Instead, he carefully placed the manuscript down onto the desk, his fingers lingering over it for a moment before he stood back. "Not yet, Watson," he replied, his voice low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "This is only the beginning." Watson frowned, stepping closer to the desk. "What do you mean? We've found the manuscript. We know what it is now." "Yes," Holmes said, his eyes fixed on the pages. "But it's not just about knowing. It's about what happens next. This manuscript isn't just a record of knowledge. It's a map, a guide to a much older system, a secret society that has been in the shadows for far longer than we realized. If Lancaster had kept it, it would have only continued to grow, to spread. Whoever holds this knowledge holds power, power that could change the very fabric of our society." The weight of his words hung heavy in the room. Watson felt it too, the realization that this case had been far more than a simple disappearance, more than a stolen object. It was about control, about knowledge, and about the dangerous consequences of that power falling into the wrong hands. "I need to destroy it," Holmes muttered, more to himself than to Watson. "Destroy it?" Watson echoed, disbelief creeping into his voice. "Holmes, we've uncovered the truth. You're saying we should destroy this piece of history? What if it's the key to understanding something much greater?" Holmes turned sharply, his gaze piercing Watson's. History is a dangerous thing to tamper with, Watson. Some knowledge is not meant to be uncovered, and this society, these men, they would stop at nothing to get their hands on this manuscript. If I don't destroy it, they will come for it, and they will stop at nothing. You saw what they did to Lancaster, and they won't hesitate to do the same to anyone who stands in their way. Watson took a step back, his mind racing as he processed Holmes's words. He had seen the way this case had changed Holmes, how it had brought out his fear of something darker than the crimes they usually investigated. For a moment Watson considered arguing, but he knew his friend too well. The decision had already been made. Holmes would protect the world from this secret at any cost, even if it meant erasing it from existence. "We can't destroy it, Holmes," Watson finally said, his voice steady but filled with a hint of pleading. "It's too important. It could answer questions we've been asking for centuries. It could change everything we know about the past." Holmes looked at him, his expression softened yet resolute. "It's not the truth that's important, Watson. It's the people who control it, and in the wrong hands, the truth becomes nothing more than a weapon." Holmes turned to Finn, who had been standing silently in the corner of the room, his eyes wide with fear. The man had been part of the conspiracy, an unwilling participant at best, but his role in the events that had unfolded was clear. "You've seen what happens when power like this is left unchecked, Mr. Finn," Holmes said, his tone cold, almost accusatory. "This manuscript is a danger to everyone who's ever known about it. It cannot be allowed to fall into the hands of those who would use it to manipulate and control." Finn nodded, his face pale and drained of color. I didn't mean for it to go this far, Mr. Holmes," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I never meant to hurt anyone. I thought I was helping, but now I see the consequences." Holmes nodded, his expression softening ever so slightly. "You were a part of something you didn't understand, Mr. Finn. But you're still alive, and that's what matters. You can still make things right. It's not too late." Finn swallowed hard, the weight of guilt heavy on his chest. "What do you want me to do?" Holmes reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small, gleaming vial. "This is the key to ending this. Once this manuscript is destroyed, the society will lose its hold. They will never come looking for it again." Holmes held the vial up, and for a moment it glinted in the firelight, almost ethereal. "There's a chemical compound in this vial that will dissolve the ink and the paper. It will render the manuscript unreadable. If it's to be destroyed, this is the only way." Watson watched silently as Holmes approached the desk. His mind was filled with conflicting thoughts, torn between his respect for his friend and his own desire to preserve the truth. But in the end he knew Holmes was right. Some secrets were too dangerous to exist. With a final, almost reluctant gesture, Holmes poured the contents of the vial onto the manuscript. The paper began to disintegrate before their eyes, the ink melting into a dark, indecipherable mess. As the pages crumbled, the last remnants of the manuscript disappeared into the ether, leaving behind only ashes. Finn watched in silence, his face blank, his hands trembling at his sides. "It's over," he whispered. Holmes stepped back, his eyes never leaving the remnants of the manuscript. "No, Mr. Finn, it's just the beginning.